Hi, everybody. If you're just joining us, we're going to wait just a little minute and make sure everyone's getting loaded up. We just went live, so we know people are coming on. I just want to make sure you're in the right place. This is the Campus Compact webinar series, and we're going to be talking about from research to action, findings from a system-wide STEM service learning research study. So I will just give us another minute while we let everyone get logged in as they're coming up to speed. And I'll go over first the logistics, some logistical information with everybody. So right now it looks like we might be up to speed with folks. So my name's Elaine Ikeda. Welcome everybody. Happy New Year. This is our first webinar of the year. I am with California Campus Compact and in partnership with Campus Compact of the Mountain West and Utah Campus Compact, we're putting on this webinar series. So this is, I think, our third webinar, our first for the new year. And as I said before, well, actually, let me go over some logistics first. For those of you who are new to Zoom, you will find that you are muted right now, and actually will be for the entire webinar. We are recording this, so it will be available on our YouTube channel later, as early as tomorrow, if not later today. And at the conclusion of this webinar, you will receive a link, an email with a link to that recording, as well as an evaluation that we'd really appreciate it if you fill out. As I said, you're muted, and but if you move your cursor to the bottom of your screen, you will see that there's a Q&A box. And so throughout the webinar, if you have any questions at all, please type them in the Q&A box. I will be monitoring them throughout, and then at the end, we're going to have time for the panelists to answer your questions. So I'll be monitoring them, and at the end, I will pose the questions to the panelists. So please, throughout the webinar, if you have questions, just type them into the Q&A box, and I'll be on top of that. So let me get started with introducing this webinar. As I said, it is called From Research to Action, Findings from a System-Wide STEM Service Learning Research Study. And we were really pleased to have the folks you're going to hear from join us today because I think this is a really important research study that's been ongoing for a couple of years now, so it's been a long-term project, and California Campus Compact was happy to be involved and supportive of the project at the beginning. So you have 4 presenters today. Judy Botello with the CSU, Cal State University, for those of you who are outside of California, Chancellor's Office. And she is the director of the Center for Community Engagement there. We have Kathy Avila-Lynn, who's a consultant with the Center for Community Engagement at the Chancellor's Office. And then Dr. Rebecca Eddy, who's the president of Cobblestone Applied Research and Evaluation, as well as Nicole Galport, her research associate there. So I'm going to turn this over to Kathy Avila-Lynn to go ahead and get us started.
Fantastic. Thank you, Elaine. Thanks, Rebecca, Nicole, Judy, and I would like to thank the California Campus Compact and Mountain West for hosting us and bringing us in. We're very happy to join you all today to share this project that we've been working on for many years, and we're really excited as we begin our sort of official rollout to share more information about the study and our findings. So what we'd like to do today, and I'll go ahead and ask Piper to forward the slide for us. Thank you. We're going to offer a quick overview of what STEM looks like in the CSU as well as an overview of the study, give you a sense of what we found and how we're thinking about our findings in terms of what that means for the work in the field. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the factors that correlate between high quality and service learning. So that's our plan for this morning. Go ahead and move that slide. Initially, I want to talk a little bit about STEM in the CSU. For those of you who aren't familiar with the California State University system, on the next slide, we have a short list of some important facts. We have 23 campuses across the state. We serve 479,000 students, along with 51,000 faculty and staff. We're the largest producer of college graduates in the STEM fields, and we sustain about 150,000 jobs in California. 1 in 10 employees in California is a CSU graduate, and that includes myself. And it's important to note that CSU awards nearly half of the state's bachelor's degrees. So that's what we look like by the numbers. Our students, here's just a quick sense of what our students look like. More than half of our students are students of color. And 1 in 3 of our undergraduates will be the first in their family to attend and ideally graduate from college. And just a little over half of our undergraduates receive Pell Grants, which, as you know, are needs-based grants, which are given to folks based on their income. And so that gives you just a little bit of a sense of what our students look like, especially as we think about the educational equity in California and what we're doing to kind of close that gap. So I'll go ahead and ask Judy if she'll share a little bit about our vision for the study.
Thanks, Kathy. So I want to talk a little bit more about what we've been doing in the CSU since 2010. At that time, my office made a commitment to increase service learning in STEM disciplines. We had at the time about 289 STEM service learning courses across the system, which was remarkably low considering the number of service learning courses that we have annually, more than 3,000, which I'll talk a little bit more about later. And so we began this precipice knowing that there was a larger conversation happening nationally. Quite frankly, in 2012, the President's Council of Advisors of Science and Technology issued a report called Excel to Engage, which stated that 1 million more science and engineering and mathematics college graduates were needed in the next 10 years. So in 2022, which is only 4 years from now, if the U.S. was to remain a global leader in science and engineering. This PCAST report, which is often referred to, is really critical to the mission and vision of the national efforts for our workforce. And the CSU, as Kathy mentioned, as one of the largest employers and generators for our economy, we have a critical role to play. And given the CSU's longstanding commitment to service learning, nearly 20 years now, we really felt that service learning could play a critical role in helping to engage our students to be more prepared and engaged and enhance their skills. In particular, we found that students had high DFW course rates in science, in their science courses and math courses across the system. And so we held this hypothesis that if service learning would be embedded in more STEM service learning courses, we would see potentially higher graduation and retention rates. And so that was the basis of our study, which Rebecca will talk to you a little bit more in the next few minutes. But first I want to share a few basic stats with you so that you understand the landscape that helped shape this study. As you will see here, this slide shows the current data and as a result, the CSU's ambitious graduation 2025 goals. So currently, as of our 2010 cohort, our 6-year graduation rates were 59%. As part of the CSU's 2025 graduation initiative, we're looking to increase 6-year graduation rates to 70%. We're also looking to eliminate the achievement gap. Here, current data shows that it's the achievement gap between underrepresented minority students, which the CSU refers to as African American, Hispanic, and Native American. There's a gap between those students, an equity gap of 12.5%. The goal is to completely eliminate that gap. Additionally, our transfer student rates are also pretty abysmal. We are looking to increase two-year rates to 45%, and currently it's at 31%. And as you will see here, the four-year graduation rates for transfer students is currently at 74%, and we're looking to increase that to 85%. In 2016, the CSU served more than 125,000 STEM students and conferred 20,201 STEM baccalaureates. However, the CSU STEM graduation rates are much lower than the national average. Of the 25% of first-time freshmen who declared a STEM major at entry in 2010, as you will see in that first bar graph, only 38% of those students persisted and graduated with a STEM degree in 6 years. These figures drastically decrease for groups of students who are historically and currently underrepresented in STEM fields. 26% of African American, Native American, and Hispanic students, 27% of first-generation students, 30% of students from low-income families, that's the Pell-eligible student group that Kathy mentioned, and 35% of women graduate within 6 years with a STEM degree. Given this audience, I won't go into the definition of service learning, but I did want to point out a little bit about the stats of service learning in the CSU. As I mentioned, we have well over 3,289 service learning courses. Of those, I would say about approximately 600 of those are in STEM disciplines, so a much shorter percentage. And we also have had an established system-wide office since 1998, and we'll be celebrating our 20-year anniversary this March. As you know, there is extensive research on service learning outcomes, but we've never taken a comprehensive study in the CSU, nor has any study been done to look at outcomes in STEM service learning that we are familiar with. We have found that even given the research of service learning and outcomes in the field, that these service learning courses don't include the essential qualities that are typically characteristic of a service learning course. And we're going to dive deep into what those key components were for our study and what we found. And so I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Rebecca Eddy, the president of Cobblestone.
Rebecca, you're muted, so can you start over?
Oh, so sorry. Yeah, thanks, Judy. I'm going to give a brief overview of our research study, some of the measures that we used, our procedures, some of our hypotheses, and some other things too, and describe kind of what we were thinking in setting up the study. If you can advance to the next slide. There are two things to know. The first is that we had this original research study that we planned out, and this was a quasi-experimental design where we had students in the treatment group or service learning STEM courses, comparing those with other students who were in non-service learning STEM courses. And we were able to carry out this design, although given the low response rate, we added another component about midway through, which is a secondary data analysis component. So I'll talk about that in a few minutes too, but essentially what we wanted to do in this kind of mixed methods approach, we had multiple instruments that we were collecting data on, be able to compare students in these courses and faculty in these STEM service learning courses to students who were in other courses. So we originally planned to have about 100 participating faculty and their students, which represented about 20% of all the CSU's service learning courses. Again, once we started data collection, we found the sample size really lacking, particularly in our control group, which was logistically very hard to construct. We added another component, and specifically we enhanced our original data collection by adding secondary data analysis using other CSU students who are not in the treatment group as carefully matched controls. And with this new match group, we compared some longer term study outcomes. And then we'll discuss today the results of the original research study as well as the secondary analysis. Next slide. Okay, so just to give you a little bit of background in terms of timeline, as Judy mentioned earlier, we started this a few years ago. In summer of 2014, we did our initial study setup, all of our IRB applications, instrument development, everything in preparation for our fall 2014 start. And we essentially had 3 cohort groups per term. The first term was fall of 2014, which is our sort of cohort 1A, and then we had the second half of that academic year in spring of 2015. We had our cohort 1B. We did subsequent cohorts, so we have a total of 5 different terms, the last data collection ending in fall of 2016. So as you can see by this, we are currently in our dissemination phase of our grant. We've done the analyses and to be able to communicate our results. We can go to the next slide. Okay, so a little bit about study recruitment, how we did this. We had to both participating faculty and their students, and we also had control students but no control faculty. To give you a little bit of a sense of how we did this, so we originally reached out to STEM faculty on multiple CSU campuses that were using the S4 data collection system, and I want to acknowledge Tracy, so much help that she provided for the S4 system, so thank you so much. And again, and this was our kind of primary way of collecting the data for the study through the S4 system. Interested faculty members provided information about the STEM service learning course, and they completed an MOU, they did some pre-testing, and then they were also required to attend an online orientation for the study to provide information about the procedures and their instruments or research questions, that sort of thing. So once they agreed to participate, then we requested that students of the classes participate by completing the online informed consent and then the pre-testing instruments, and then at the end of the term, post-test materials were emailed to students who had based on their pre-test participation. So that was for the treatment group. For the control group, we recruited for those STEM service learning courses in those departments. We contact the deans of those departments and other faculty in those departments to be able to determine appropriate comparison non-service learning courses. And so once we established those appropriate comparisons, then we contacted students directly via email to solicit their participation. A bit about incentives: faculty were given a small stipend for their participation for completing our instruments and communicating with their students, and then students were given a chance to win an Amazon gift card for their participation. Okay, next slide. All right, so just as an overview of what we were looking for, several research questions guiding our work. The first, as you can see on the left side, it's really about understanding the landscape of service learning STEM in the CSU. So, for example, how is service learning in STEM currently being implemented, given the vast range of interpretations of service learning? We're operating from the assumption that there are multiple interpretations of what this could mean, although there's lots of overlap, so we wanted to know what was actually happening in these courses. Further, we wanted to find out what were the common underlying elements that were happening within the service learning implementation. Was it just a few things that were happening consistently across the board, or were there lots of things that were happening simultaneously in these courses? And then finally, to what degree are these essential elements of high quality service learning present in participating courses? And this idea of quality is important for our research study because we wanted to say, you know, it's not just a matter of was it being done or is it a service learning course or not, but exactly what's happening, what is the experience of students, what is the experience of faculty, and can we determine or distinguish some level of quality and by our ratings and by our development of our instruments. So that's what we're looking for. The other part of this, it's really about the outcomes. So, for example, does service learning in STEM have positive impact on student success in 3 areas? And this is sort of our major student instruments that we're using. Academic achievement, we looked at in a couple different ways, career development and civic engagement. And the civic engagement includes both behaviors and attitudes. The second outcome question really is related to this concept of, do we have different results with respect to outcomes for those in, depending on the quality of the service learning course. And then finally, ultimately, does this promote access to professional realm for students or bring about meaningful change in undergraduate training, particularly for underserved populations? So we ultimately want to know that as the longer term research question. Okay, so again, we wanted to uncover these essential elements and be able to understand whether these were linked to any particular outcomes. I will provide just a brief overview of hypotheses that we had. We did expect that service learning experiences would allow students to, first and foremost, acquire some technical skills in their STEM courses, potentially increase their interest in STEM careers, and also improve their attitudes and behaviors around STEM and civic engagement. So those were the hypotheses that we expected to be able to find or support during our study. Ultimately, participation in service learning is expected to have a longer term impact if the literature is accurate in that, in terms of greater retention, ultimately graduation in STEM fields, and increased civic engagement even beyond the college years. So we were able to test these hypotheses in our research study, and Nicole is actually going to talk about some of those specific results. Before we do, just a little bit about the instruments that we used and the methods. So again, as I mentioned, we had faculty types of measures. We also had student measures. So really briefly, the faculty pretest survey, they completed this at the beginning of their course about information specific to their course and their discipline. For example, we wanted to know if the service learning requirement was optional or required for students, and how important certain things were to that faculty. For example, you know, having effective pedagogy or engaging students with respect to the service learning project. At the end of the course, we also had a post-test survey, and we asked them to really describe what they did in terms of their course for their pedagogy. For example, describe any active learning strategies they used, you know, and then also like examples of things like, upon reflecting about your recent experience, you know, rate your own level of, for example, awareness of their community, if that's expanded, or the relationships with their students. So we had them self-rate on those elements at the end of the course. We also did what we call a faculty log, and that was where they could answer questions based on the rubric we developed of these elements of service learning. And we'll talk about this a little bit more in the next slide. We, upon reviewing the literature, came up with about 15 core elements that could potentially be in these service learning courses. And so we wanted to ask them specifically about how they rated on each of these 15 elements, for example, the reflection component of the course. So, for example, to what extent was the course designed to address a community need, or how was the service learning integrated into the curriculum, that sort of thing. So we asked that at the end as well. For the students, we did pre and post testing, and a couple of, just a brief overview of what we used. The Student Civic Engagement Survey, this is the Do a Little in Fall 2013 Civic Engagement Scale. We had them rate. There was both items related to attitudes as well as behaviors. We also had a STEM career interest and awareness survey, and this is the Tyler Wood et al. 2010, addressing attitudes about careers within the STEM fields, also as a pre-post. And then at the end of the term, we also had those treatment students or service learning course students essentially rate very similar questions based on a rubric that their faculty rated to try to get some triangulation of faculty and student ratings to see their perceptions of the presence of certain elements like reflections, like addressing community need, etc. So we did that. Students, again, took these measures at pre-test, post-test, and then we also did a one-year follow-up related to the scales for civic engagement, attitudes and behaviors, and then the STEM career interest. The final elements that we used as part of the study, we had institutional research data that we collected from all the CSUs, so we didn't rely on self-reports from students. Again, demographic information, grades, retention, and graduation, etc. that we used. We also had an expert in service learning code each syllabus for the course based on the Heffernan Fundamentals of Service Learning course construction rubric. So they were given a score of, I believe it was 1 to 4 in each of the dimensions and what should be in a syllabus for a service learning course. So we did all of these things. As I mentioned, we added additional IR data from CSUs that the Chancellor's Office was able to perform some additional analyses on, but essentially this is part of our primary data collection for our study. Okay, next slide. Okay, as I mentioned, it's a little bit important to kind of understand how we generated each of the dimensions about service learning courses that we started with. First, we reviewed the literature based on what's been theorized in the past about essential elements in service learning. We developed from this list 15 specific areas, for example, reflections, community need, linked to learning outcomes, those sorts of things. And then from there, we had an initial survey that students and faculty developed based on these particular areas. And the goal was to statistically combine items into a smaller number of scales, which would then comprise the overall quality of the service learning experience. And so we pretty much took a highly exploratory approach to be able to figure out what really emerged from here. So the initial analysis, it didn't reveal any clear patterns about how they were distinct from each other. So we then revisited the idea of having 2 raters from the research team review the survey items, see which ones theoretically could be complementary to each other or theoretically related to each other, and then we could then statistically test whether these groupings did in fact represent distinct components of quality. So we did some just reliabilities on these items that we thought should go together. So based on the initial reviewers' ratings, we had 6 components that we identified, and these include the following: frequency of communication, quality of reflections, addressing community need, the course linked to academic content, degree of service learning preparation, and a values focus. And so using the student ratings of these questions, we developed some internal consistencies for these components. For those that had 2 or more questions per area, to be able to determine if they were good items that sort of hung together to test our constructs. And we were able to do reliability analyses on these, and basically we have multiple items for each of these, for most of these categories. I will say one of the severe limitations of our study is that we didn't have enough in each of these categories. So I think future work will definitely include developing some more items to make sure that we have some consistency there. So at the end, we have 8 elements that we're testing here. The next slide, you can see what these items include. So we can go into more depth with any of these if you'd like. Again, learning objectives, addressing community need, collaboration, reflection. So those are the distinct constructs that we believe emerge from both the student ratings after the review of the literature and some initial exploratory analyses. So I'll give you an idea too. From here, there are 2 of these that only have 1 item each, again, which we would like to enhance in future research. If you turn to the next slide, you can see some reliabilities for each of these. So for example, we have 5 reflections questions, all that are, correlated together essentially at 0.94, which is very high. Values focus, we have 4 questions, collaboration with community and community need, 3 questions each. And then those categories that really need more questions linked to academic content, we only had 2, and then the last 2, learning objectives and service learning preparation, we have 1 question that represent those. So that gives you a little bit of an idea. One example of like collaboration with the community factor would be, to what extent did collaboration take place between faculty and community partner? Then we asked about students and community partner, and then students and faculty. So again, just to reiterate, we asked students this, we also asked faculty, and then we were able to find some consistency between these ratings, and ultimately use the student ratings because we had, a lot more data points to be able to develop these for the level of quality. The last piece of information I'll share with you is this idea of quality. So again, we had multiple things happening. We had the syllabus quality happening. We had the faculty quality rating happening. We had student quality rating. From most of these, again, we had a lot more data points for student quality as opposed to other things. And so we had an average score for each of those individual components. And we're able to assign a rating of low, medium, and high based on those student quality ratings. So that's essentially what we're coming up with. So when we say high quality service learning, it's based on those ratings, and it's a subset of all of the courses that were included in the study. So with all of that as a setup, I'm going to have Nicole provide a little bit more information about the study findings, and then kind of future directions after that. So I'm going to hand it over to Nicole, and we'll certainly follow up if we have questions for later on.
Great. Thank you, Rebecca. So now that we've gone through the overview, we get to dive into what I am most excited about is the results of our research study. So to kind of give you a quick overview of our participants, we were able to have participants from 10 different campuses, 10 different CSU campuses, and 47 faculty members that were in the treatment condition. And so while we have both students from treatment and control, we have 47 faculty members that were teaching treatment courses. And in total, that results to about 2,000 students. We have here 2,100 students. I should note that that is 2,100 students that provided data. There are a little bit more than 2,000 students, individual unique students. The reason why that number is a little bit different is because we had, over the course of the years that we did this study, there were a couple students that ended up participating more than one time in different ways. So for example, there were some students who were maybe in spring 2015, they were in a treatment course, but then in but in fall 2015, they were in a control course. So what we had to do was go through and meticulously track where students were in their condition, which is why that we are counting a little bit more than 2,100 student responses. So in taking all of those factors, we kind of funnel down into our unit of analysis, which is a cluster. So instead of doing individual classes, we chose to use this unit of analysis that we called a cluster because some faculty members would teach the same course in different years. So those were two distinct courses, but some faculty members would teach the same course, but in two different sections within the same year. Theoretically, those classes are identical. They have the same assignments, they have the same procedures, they have the same grading that they're using. So we ended up clustering those classes together into one unit of analysis. So when we go through everything, we ended up having 78 different clusters or units of analysis. Next slide, please. Thank you. So really quick, we wanted to also share what our participation demographic information looked like. You can see there was a little bit more males and females. There's also just a quick note, a little chunk that is missing there because we were unable to gather that information either from the participants or from the IR offices on campus. About 40% of these student participants were classified as underrepresented minorities. About half were Pell Grant eligible, and the majority of them, about 80%, were STEM majors. One thing we also wanted to note is that this information breakdown is very similar to the CSU demographic composition. So really quick, I'd like to go over some general findings. As Rebecca mentioned, most of this is going to be focused on the student quality ratings, but one thing that we wanted to show was also the quality ratings of the syllabus. So very generally, we found service learning really varies across the different campuses that were in our study, across the 10 campuses. They vary in terms of the number and catalog and types of courses, as well as the quality. So looking here with this figure, this shows the kind of the distribution of quality for the syllabus rating that Dr. Eddy spoke about earlier. So you can see on the right-hand side that there are a large group of syllabus that were coded that were of high quality. So in looking at the syllabus, you could tell that this was a service learning course. All the way on the other side, however, you see there are quite a few syllabus that were for classes that were in the treatment condition of our study that were characterized as very low. So in a lot of those cases, it meant that the criteria that we were looking for was not present in the service learning syllabus. So some of our general study findings. We found that students who participated in the service learning courses reported higher civic engagement attitudes at post-test compared to the control students. This was a statistically significant difference. We also found, though, that students' interest in STEM-related careers was more based on their own academic major, and that makes sense, right? So if we think back to the slide that we showed earlier with the demographic distribution, about 80% of the students in our study were STEM majors. So you would hope that they would have a fairly high interest in pursuing STEM-related careers. But when we looked at that in a little bit more depth and controlled for academic major, we found that students that were in the service learning courses did increase from pre-test to post-test with their STEM career interests, as opposed to control students who actually decreased slightly from pre-test to post-test. As a very honest researcher, I do want to draw your attention to two things on this slide, which was that last bullet point that I was talking about. All the way on the left-hand side, you will see that the axis does not start at 0. That's because this is a small but meaningful change. And so we did not start the axis at 0 because we wanted, for the purpose of this presentation, to be able to see that difference. Second, all the way on the left or the right-hand side of the slide, you'll see the number of students that participated in this analysis for treatment and control. There are a lot more treatment students, but for the purpose of this analysis, all of the assumptions were met, and we can move forward with this. But what this does show is that, again, at pretest, treatment students slightly lower than the control students, and while at post-test they did have lower STEM career interest, they did show an increase as opposed to the control students that actually showed a slight decrease from pretest to post-test. So now that we've talked generally about the outcomes, one thing that we really wanted to be able to look at was all of the different components that we identified from service learning that Dr. Eddy talked about earlier. Do the presence of those components end up predicting any of the outcomes of interest? What we ended up finding was that some of the components, specifically collaboration, being linked to academic content, and a focus on values, all predicted more positive civic engagement attitudes, and collaboration and that link to academic content were the strongest predictors of positive civic engagement attitudes. One thing that we did find, though, however, was that the frequency of communication predicted less positive civic engagement attitudes, such that students who reported a lot of frequency of communication, really at that upper end, they were less likely to have positive student engagement attitudes compared to the other students. So that's something that was very surprising and something that we may want to explore further in the future. We also looked at civic engagement behavior, and again, we found collaboration being linked to academic content and a focus on values all predicted positive civic engagement behavior. When we looked at each one of these factors individually, focus on values was the strongest predictor, but we did want to note that it did not necessarily meet the threshold for statistical significance. And finally, for STEM career interest, we found yet again being linked directly to academic content was the strongest predictor. Based on the last 3 slides, you'll note that being linked directly to academic content, according to students, was the strongest predictor for all 3 of these outcomes. So that was looking at the comparison of pre-test and post-test. As was mentioned earlier, we also did a 1-year follow-up. And what we ended up finding was some interesting interactions. We didn't find anything for civic engagement behaviors, but for both civic engagement attitudes and for STEM career interest, at pre-test, the treatment group started a little bit, had lower attitudes compared to the control, but in both cases at the 1-year follow-up, they both experienced or expressed more positive civic engagement attitudes and more STEM career interests. And I will draw your attention to what I mentioned before, that the axis on both of these charts does not start at 0, but it is meant so that we can show you, so you can actually visualize the difference. And while the control and treatment groups are uneven in terms of the size of students, the necessary assumptions were met in order to run this analysis. In thinking about some of these outcomes, one of the most important things that we wanted to look at was the quality of the clusters. So before we had been looking at the quality of those individual aspects of service learning, but it was also really important for us to see the overall cluster, the overall quality of that course. And what we ended up finding was that students in high quality clusters reported on average more positive civic engagement attitudes, as well as more positive civic engagement behaviors as compared to the low quality courses. I will note that we did not find any differences for those courses that were kind of labeled as a medium quality. We didn't see any differences there, but we were very happy to see that there was a difference when thinking about quality in terms of high quality clusters and low quality clusters. And as Dr. Eddy mentioned earlier, some of the outcomes that we were really interested in looking at, we just weren't able to tap into based off of the original design in terms of the surveys that we were giving out to students. So what we ended up doing was working with the Chancellor's office to do a secondary data analysis. As was mentioned earlier, we looked at all treatment students and then pulled information for all control students and then did propensity score matching to be able to establish an appropriate control group, comparison group for the treatment students. And what we found in terms of retention and graduation was that 4-year retention rates, treatment students on average for the 2 cohorts that were available, 2011 and 2012, had slightly higher 4-year retention rates, about 4%. And then we look at 4-year graduation rates. In 2011, that cohort, the control students actually graduated at a slightly higher rate, but at 2012, that is flipped, where the treatment students were graduating at a slightly higher rate. One thing to note, though, is that when looking at the CSU, especially for STEM students, the most common way that graduation is looked at is using 6-year graduation rates as opposed to 4-year graduation rates. So if you can go to the next slide, please. Based off of the time in which we were looking at this data, the only cohort that we had information available for was the 2010 cohort. And so we looked at those 6-year graduation rates and retention. And this is for first-time freshmen. You'll see that with the control group with retention, was retaining slightly lower than the treatment group, but we do see a little bit of a bigger difference when looking at the 6-year graduation rates for the first-time freshmen, 45% for the control group and almost 80% for the treatment group. And it is important to note that we did not only have first-time freshmen in our study sample, we also had transfer students. So in looking at transfer students, looking at 4-year rates for graduation is more commonly done, being that they have experience prior to transferring into the institution. So we'll see that for the cohorts that we have available, 2010, 2011, and 2012, the students that are in the treatment group we're graduating at a higher rate consistently for each one of those cohorts. And with that, I will turn it over.
So this is Elaine again. Let me turn on my video. Well, thank you guys very much. That was so interesting. And so I want to invite participants, if you didn't hear me at the beginning, you're invited at the bottom of your screen. There is a Q&A box where you can click on that and type in any questions that you have about what was just presented. And I will ask those questions to Judy and Nicole, Rebecca, and Kathy, depending on who's the best person to answer. And just to give you time to do a little typing, I have a question that I actually wanted to ask folks, and I'm just curious that you noted on one of the slides that the frequency of communication was actually didn't have a positive effect on civic engagement behavior. I'm just curious if any of you have a possible rationale for, because I was a little surprised to hear that result.
I can be the first one to answer it, and please feel free to jump in. Yeah, that was a very surprising result for us. I think that out of all of the findings that we had, that was the one that surprised me the most. In looking at the data, and again, this is something that we will hopefully look at a little bit more, is that it seemed like there was kind of a drop-off point where there was more of an optimum level of engagement, and then once that threshold was kind of passed, then we saw that the numbers started to go down a little, and so I think that what that's telling me, or at least how I'm interpreting it, is that for students to be really active and engaged, that you don't want to oversaturate them with the amount of communication. And I don't know if anybody else had a different possible explanation.
And also, if you can say a little, what was that communication? I mean, are you talking about logistical information, or are you talking about the reflection and asking them to, so maybe you can say a little bit more about what kind of, if you know, what kind of communication?
Yeah, so we were asking specifically with the number of times students met face-to-face with the community, and I believe that we also looked at phone calls as well as email. So we tried to kind of tap into all of the different ways that they may communicate.
I think the saturation hypothesis is probably reasonable. You know, it also kind of shows the need for faculty to kind of carefully construct and monitor these service learning experiences to be able to make sure they're appropriate for students. It is possible that community partners were too overwhelming to students, and the more frequent communication was not helpful in then being able to carry out their project. So that's entirely possible. And we also understand that the projects vary widely, right, in terms of what they're doing in each of these courses. And so that's something also to keep in mind too, something that we didn't sort of code qualitatively, which I think would be a really interesting way to explore this too, like the types of projects. We know these are all STEM, but perhaps the types of interaction, the types of projects are really having something to do with students' kind of level of exhaustion or even satisfaction or something with respect to these things that we did measure. So that just another thing. I don't know if Judy wanted to add any other possible explanations. That's, I think, is reasonable.
No, I think you covered those, Rebecca.
Great, thanks. Piper, can you put up the next slide, which has, I just want to make sure if people are possibly have to get going to another meeting or something, have to log off, I want to make sure they have the contact information for our presenters. So another question is, how did you account for selection bias in your study?
I would say, long story short, we didn't, which is to say what we know likely that one can make the argument students who are taking service learning courses are more likely to have different characteristics, maybe initially more civic minded or engaged, have different personnel characteristics, whatever. The thing that kind of refutes that a little bit for me is that the number of students who reported that they didn't know it was a service learning course to begin with, so which I thought was actually kind of surprising. So we had asked them why they took the course, and a couple of reasons. And I think, and Nicole, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I think it was a lot higher than we thought it would be, that the students who actually took the course did not know when they registered that it was a service learning course. So it sort of refutes a little bit of the fact that these are the students more likely to take these type of courses, but a little bit anyway. But potentially you're not able to control for that selection bias ultimately. Nicole, any thoughts?
Oh, yeah, I just wanted to agree that when we were looking at that question, the results from that question, some of the general options were that it was, maybe a requirement for their major, that they were interested in giving back to the community. And then there were a couple more options, and there were quite a few students, a large percentage, that had indicated that they were not aware that it was a service learning course. So I do think, Rebecca, that you're right in that would be a good variable then maybe to kind of look to see if that influences any of the other results.
Thank you. So we do have a question coming in from one of our participants, Diane at Cal State San Bernardino. What majors were included in the study? She says she knows it's STEM majors, but that definition can vary widely. So I don't know if you guys can summarize, provide a little overview of what the majors were that you included in STEM.
Kathy, you want to take that, Kathy? I can say that we use the NSF definition of what constitutes STEM, except we did not include the social sciences, what the NSF definition does.
Yep, that's exactly what I was going to say.
And NSF, for those who may not be familiar, is the National Science Foundation.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Okay, so another question of a finding that was a little bit surprising was that reflection was not a strong predictor for civic engagement, attitudes or behaviors, or of STEM career interests. So can you say a little bit about why that might have been, and where reflection fell as a predictor of the 8 components of your research study?
So I don't have it right in front of me where it fell, but one thing that might be important to note is that the way that reflection was done in these courses did vary. So we asked faculty members as well as students to report the ways in which reflection was done. So that may have been in individual journals that they wrote in, reflecting with a peer or in shared journals. And so my initial thought is that it may be because reflection varied in how it was implemented across classes and across clusters. I don't know if anyone else has any other hypotheses.
Right, even though I think the reflection questions obviously sort of were highly correlated with each other. But again, that's another really good question to follow up on the reflection piece. Maybe it's the type of reflection that they were able to do. Given our sample size, though, we couldn't really do that kind of analysis, but we do know that reflections were done in multiple different ways, as Nicole mentioned as an example. Final reflection projects, about 30% of students and faculty said that they that's how they did reflections. They might have done that in addition to other things too, like again the personal journals. That was about 25-30%. Final papers was about half. So those might have been done in different ways. And again, I would probably like to see that explored a little bit more carefully in terms of what we mean by reflection and defining it better. And even though everyone did the same, let's say they all wrote final reflection papers, those prompts could be very different. So it requires a little bit more study in terms of what exactly they're doing.
Great, thanks. So I guess, and this might be a question more for Judy, but what do you see that this study, what implications does this study have for our broader field of service learning, civic engagement, and in particular, I'm thinking about diversity, equity, inclusion, and supporting the underrepresented students that you highlighted at the front of how many are in the CSU. So I don't know if any of you want to comment, and then we'll have another question coming up from Pilar at CSU Channel Islands.
So for me, the study gives us some information we have not known, in fact. So the variety, we've always assumed that, but what that looks like across the system, I think is beneficial. It's going to help us do some professional development, both within our service learning centers and with our faculty across the system. I think because the study was only a 2.5-year pilot, and as you saw in the secondary data analysis, for us to really grasp the full retention and graduation rate information that we seek here in the system office, we're hoping to track that. And so one of the things we are contemplating is what other further research studies can we do? And so we've thought about 3 different kinds of things that we are considering, and I think once we share these results with our service learning leaders in the CSU to talk a little bit more about what we can do. For me personally, while this was specific to STEM, I think the information that we have gathered here could be reflective of what is occurring in the CSU across other disciplines. Although I would make another hypothesis if we were to do an additional study to see, well, because STEM and service learning is predominantly quite new. We didn't begin a real concerted effort until 2010. And so we know that faculty get more comfortable in teaching the pedagogy and also having their relationships with community partners. And so one of my hypotheses would be, would we see higher quality service learning courses and disciplines that have been traditionally had a service learning component? And so I'd be interested in looking at that. And that's one of the things that we're considering, is whether we want to do another study looking at that, or adding to this study that incorporates the other disciplines also across the system. And as Rebecca's mentioned, really going a little bit in depth in some of those questions to participants who took pre and post. And so doing some follow-up studies. We were fortunate with this study that we actually did do, and I know the ends were low, but our 2014 cohort students were able to do a 2-year follow-up. And we did have some folks participate in that. We've also talked about doing possibly a retrospective study to code the available syllabi from the current study and look at quality and run existing IR data for retention and graduation for just those syllabi. and then some other pieces that we're considering to incorporate some of the work that we're doing around STEM and community engagement out of my office with an additional study to support campus implementation, in particular for our underrepresented students.
Great, thank you.
I'll just add briefly too, yeah, I mean, I think it's sort of obvious to me anyway, looking at it from our perspective, that the professional development opportunity for faculty, for directors is really big, that even to be able to get on the same page again with faculty and say, okay, here's the essential elements you need to include in your syllabus, which has two things, two functions: to communicate that to students what's expected and what they're going to experience, but also ensures that element is actually in the course, embedded, some way. So I feel like that's a really good sort of low-hanging fruit that you could take from this to say, okay, if you have faculty doing these types of courses, here's sort of a checklist, or here's a these different characteristics you can consider to be able to kind of get them on the same page and up to speed really quickly. And then further, you can kind of investigate the quality of the projects and communication and some of these other things after that. But I feel like that's pretty important too, to be able to kind of get at first.
Great. Okay, so Pilar has a question. Do you have information about how many students were engaged in direct service and or indirect service, for example, research and advocacy?
So Pilar, you're asking about the type of activity they did?
Direct service or indirect, if you actually identify, did you break it down and look at that?
No, we did not. As Rebecca mentioned, I think in some recent comments, we did not look at the activities that students were engaged in as part of their experience. So whether it was direct or indirect.
Okay, great. Okay, so it doesn't look like any other questions are coming in. So first, I'd like to thank you all, the panelists. Thank you so much for sharing this, allowing this to be one of the first platforms that you share more widely your results with the nation. So thank you very much for that. And I want to just let folks know, in case they're interested, our next webinar features Rick Battistoni from Providence College, as you know, one of the many leaders in our field. He's going to be speaking on community or political engagement, educating for democracy in troubled times. And we actually had a run through with him this morning, and I'm excited for his talk on February 6th. March 15th, we have equity and inclusion for the 1%, not that 1%. They're talking about student veterans in higher education, and that one will be led and coordinated by Campus Compact of the Mountain West. And then our final webinar for the year will be on April 10th, and it's about engaging immigrant communities, and you're going to get to hear about a wonderful course here at Cal State East Bay, which is where we're housed at California Campus Compact, and the partnerships with the community agencies, and in particular also working across difference. So that's going to be a really good top conversation about engaging immigrant communities. So with that, I just want to say you will receive a follow-up email with a link to this webinar, which has been recorded. So you'll receive a link to the YouTube posting of that, and as well as an evaluation. So if you could fill that out, we'd greatly appreciate getting any feedback you have about this presentation. And so with that, I'll ask the presenters to stay on, and we'll let Piper go ahead and close out the recording. And thank